Hello, Dr. Roger Elmer, Advanced Neurospinal Solutions, and in our video lecture today we're going to talk a little bit about seizures. We had somebody asking about seizures. They have a relative that gets them. We're currently dealing with two patients that have brain injuries that are incurring seizures. And what are they, and how are they normally treated, and what do we do here, and what kind of results do we see with that? Seizures are storms that happen within the brain. Usually when the brain does something, it has a specific reason for doing whatever it does. And there are two major functions that the brain that the brain does, particularly the motor cortex, which includes the frontal lobe here. That frontal lobe includes the limbic brain, which is on the inside, right in here. This is the emotional motor system. But the motor system really only does two things: contracts muscles and secretes stuff. That's what it's limited to. Now, there are lots of other functions that happen as a result, including thinking. You say, well, what about thinking? I actually do some thinking. I mean, especially if you're a woman, you do a lot of thinking. Probably more than you should, but and guys, we don't do any, right? So, but in terms of thinking is a product of movement, and we don't do any thinking without moving. And you say, well, I really didn't move to think the thought that I just thought. Yeah, actually you did. Most of the time we're doing a lot of eye movement, and the eye movement causes us to be able to think. We ignite motor pathways, and that causes us to be able to think. So in that process, but when it tells the body to do something, it's usually a pre-patterned concept, something that it wants to do for a reason. A seizure is a nonsensical, non-productive firestorm within the brain that's creating movement or motor activity. Now, a seizure itself is an unconscious event. Now, you could be conscious in the engaging of that firestorm, but then rendered unconscious. And what that does, what that means is that this activity or firestorm actually happened in a way that also reached out to what's called the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system is what keeps you awake, alert, and alive, and thinking and doing things throughout the day, or it has you sleeping. It does one or the other, and we'll get more into that when we get into sleeping and sleep disorders and that. But when we look at the brainstem, the brain and the brainstem itself, the reticular activating system is a part of the center of the pons, which is right here, the pons and the medulla. We call it the reticular system, and it's known as the reticular activating system, the RAS. The RAS, not to be confused with rodents of unusual size, is the system that keeps us awake or renders us unconscious. When a firestorm also reaches out to the RAS and engages an unconscious experience, then we go into a seizure. If it creates a movement without rendering us unconscious, we call that more of a myoclonus, a myoclonic event, because it's happening while we're conscious and that. But a seizure renders us unconscious because it reaches out and touches that system and changes us from being awake into a lower state of consciousness. So that's what a seizure is. The reason it happens, and if you talk to doctors, they'll say, well, we really aren't sure why they happen. Well, actually, it's pretty simple from a physiological point of view, and we've talked about this before. We've talked about the idea of neuroplasticity and how the cells, in neuroplasticity, the cells are getting more healthy and stronger and able to do more. They're able to learn and grow. The best description of neuroplasticity is the ability of the cell to adapt. Its increased ability to adapt to whatever stress is on it. The opposite, or what we call the dark side to neuroplasticity, on the negative side of the number line, would be transneural degeneration. That's transneural degeneration causes a cell to start to break down. And if you don't use it,
You lose it.
Oh, that's great. We had, 30 people in the audience responding. Thank you, Jessica. That was wonderful. Right? If you don't use it, you lose it. And that cell depends upon activity in order to go through cellular housekeeping, which is called cellular immediate early gene response. And when it doesn't do that over and over again, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. Parts start to break down. And you would think that it would become harder to fire. Actually, it creates shifts within itself to become more sensitive so that anything can stimulate it, including things that are chemicals besides neurotransmitters, that they can kick it over the edge so they can fire. And when a TND cell or a group of TND cells ignite, they get going. And they're hoping to be able to do that so that they can save their own lives through the cellular housekeeping system, which is immediate early gene response. Well, that's what starts the firestorm. So we have weak cells that are degenerating. The pattern of the activity in the seizure, any other things that happen before, during, or after, including hallucinations of sound, smells, tastes, visuals, tell a lot about where these cells are. And then same kind of thing with migraine headaches. If a person has a migraine headache and they're seeing white light, some of the TNZ cells are definitely in the frontal lobe. If they're seeing colors, it's in the back, and those cells are in the back, in the occipital lobe, and that. If they're hearing things, that's in the temporal lobe. We got some temporal lobe stuff, which is very often an area where we're having seizures start from, what we call the nidus of the seizure. But also, if you're hearing words, that's definitely left temporal lobe in the Wernicke's area, and so we get clues from the history of how do these things happen or engage. These things always happen when the patient is more fatigued, and fatigue includes poor nutrition. So they're going to kick off a lot easier if they're not getting enough in way of carbs and fats, but particularly proteins, to do that immediate early gene response. So that's a big explanation on the cellular part of the problem. Those weak cells need to be brought up to speed. Now, normally they're given chemicals, different kind of medications. We're not going to go into those, and they're trying to avoid that process. The problem with that is, over time, those cells, when they don't get the activity they need, they are going to die. And we want to take and stimulate those cells to find where those cells are and to begin to stimulate them to bring them up to health again, from transneurodegenerated cells up to plasticity, or we call them plastic cells. We're going to evoke plasticity. We can do that by actually stimulating them directly. If we do that and it causes a cell to fire, it causes a process that, like we said, immediate early gene response. We can also do something that's kind of the opposite. We can cause an inhibition of those cells. Now, the cool thing about inhibiting a cell is, if we stimulate a cell and we're exciting it and causing that cell to fire, we are creating immediate early gene response, which is what my intent of getting these cells to become healthy. But it also has to fire, which takes energy, and then it has to reset to fire again, which takes energy. If I can do it another way, meaning inhibit the cell, if I inhibit the cell, it'll go through that early gene response, but it won't fire and reset, which means it saved a bunch of energy for that cell through the continued process of healing. And so oftentimes my strategy isn't necessarily to fire that system directly, especially at first. It's to find a way in that will create an inhibitory response on it, inhibitory stimulation, to cause those cells to just go through the immediate early gene response. We call it depolarization. The cell goes actually in the opposite direction, where it doesn't want to fire. In fact, it doesn't want to fire in the future, but it's causing all the energy to go towards the health of that cell. Very cool. And then we can get it to the point where that cell is healthy enough to where we could drive it directly to where it goes through the process of being able to fire and reset and not be degraded by it. And so that's the kind of thing that we do. We do that through examination, finding where the problem is. Any problem that is in the brain, any central problem, is going to have manifestations that are findable either on history or exam or just observation. We're going to find that. Any peripheral problem is going to have an effect on the central system, meaning spinal cord, brainstem, and brain itself. And so we find those and we start to work with them. And one of the cool things that we do here that was discovered, through research science, group was working, and some of the research was done at Harvard, and there are a couple of books on it, very interesting, where stimulating cranial nerve number 10 directly, they were cutting into the neck and inserting electrodes into cranial nerve 10 on the carotid artery and stimulating it, and they were eliminating the patient's seizures through stimulating cranial nerve 10. And then, as they were working with these patients in this research, they found also that if they, one of the researchers asked, well, what else is there anything else that's improving besides your seizures have gone away? And the patient said, well, yeah, I used to have anxiety disorder, now I don't. And another patient said, well, yeah, and my neuropathy is cut in half. And well, that's cool, because the parasympathetic nervous system cranial nerve 10 is one of those, we call it the craniosacral IML system, or the parasympathetic nervous system. So anything that we would want to do with the parasympathetic, we could potentially do it through that system. But here we don't cut into your neck. We actually use a simple TENS unit with a very specific frequency and a very, very specific intensity level. And we clip a little electrode on the tragus of your ear and one on your wrist or on the front of your shin, and drive that system directly. And we have 2 patients who have brain injuries from the past who suffer seizures, who now are significantly lessened or completely altogether gone, which is very fun. And that is one of the major therapies that we're doing on them to cause that system to no longer have that problem. We're also working with the brain directly, stimulating those cells like we talked about. So if you have any other questions about seizure disorders, let us know. We'll do another video for you. Thanks.